Gabe, a few days ago, we saw some fantastic announcements from WWDC, and the Apple fan in me loves this week, WWDC, every year. But I want to talk about some of the announcements we saw this week. And one of those announcements was Apple Intelligence, and it brought the question, will AI make us less reliant on our phones? What do you think about that?
I think there is zero chance that AI makes us less reliant on our phones.
And this question was actually asked to Tim Cook, who's the Apple CEO. And his response, obviously the iPhone is their number one product, so his answer was strategic, but it very much came down to, it's not going to make us less reliant on our phones, but it's going to make the user experience better. It's going to make the phones or even their Macs easier to use.
Yeah, I think that's fair. And because that's sort of the reason I say it won't make us less reliant. Because if the user experience is better with an iPhone, with a Mac, with all of the other products that Apple is selling, and all of those things work better together, driven by, I'm going to use my air quotes here, Apple Intelligence, then it's going to make us more reliant on those solutions because the user experience is going to be better. And we've seen other products start to come out that people think are going to take away from phone usage, like the Hume Pin, like the Rabbit device that came out a couple of months ago that was widely panned. But these things have not been a smartphone replacement. So, in my view, all of this AI stuff that's being built into the phone, yeah, it is going to make the experience better. And that's exactly why we're going to use our phones more.
I cringed twice with what you just said. Number one, Apple Intelligence always just, I appreciate what they're trying to do. I understand it, but after, a year and a half, 2 years now of artificial intelligence being this big hype, and now Apple coming in late and saying Apple Intelligence, I'm just, ugh. But the other part was the Rabbit. I can't stand that product. Thank goodness
well,
that
you
thing
are not
flopped.
alone.
Yeah, that thing got some serious reviews on YouTube, and going back to our episode last week, is all press good press? No, and not in the Rabbit's case. But Gabe, one of the things, so today we want to talk about WWDC, but one of the things Apple announced was, again, Apple Intelligence, and the devices it's limited to is quite, I don't want to say it's narrow, it's nothing
It's pretty narrow.
Yeah, it's kind of what I would expect, right? Because, AI is a fairly resource-intensive platform, right? But when it comes to the upgrade cycle, I know you pulled some numbers on this, and I want to talk about just kind of the math behind it before we get into what exactly is Apple Intelligence.
Yeah, I agreed. And I think there's to me, this speaks to why Apple did this the way that they did, right? And why they're calling it Apple Intelligence. And as much as that term makes you cringe, Zach, it's brilliant branding by them, much like when they came up with spatial computing when they launched the Vision Pro. That was not a term that anybody was thinking about. They effectively invented a market. And I think they're trying to do the same thing with Apple Intelligence. And they talked so much about privacy at WWDC, about how all of this stuff is happening in private cloud or on the phone. And that does make it very resource intensive, to your point. So when we talk about the monetization cycle of how Apple is going to monetize AI, or Apple Intelligence as they're calling it, there are 1.46 billion iPhones in the world. That is a huge number. And if you had to guess, Zach, around what percentage do you think can support Apple Intelligence right now, what do you think that percentage would be?
Not to geek out, Gabe, I did make a spreadsheet after Apple's last Q1 earnings, and I was breaking it down by device category, but I can't remember the number off the top of my head.
It's less than 10%. So the products that can support Apple Intelligence right now are the 15 Pro and the 15 Pro Max, and that's pretty much it. Now, they are obviously going to have new devices here in the near future, whenever, obviously probably the 16 that will be able to support it also. But it's a very, very small percentage of their users right now who can take advantage of this new functionality that's going to be rolled out as part of iOS 18, and then even further down the road with the integration with ChatGPT later in the year. So if you've got less than 10% of your customers that can take advantage of it, that means that over 90% of your customers cannot. That's 1.31 billion iPhones that cannot support it. They will need to upgrade in order to be able to leverage Apple Intelligence. So I was just trying to think of rough numbers. So if 10% of those people upgraded their phone at an average sale price of roughly $1,000, which I think is pretty accurate based on what we've seen for people getting charged for iPhones in the past. That's $131 billion in new revenue, iPhone revenue for Apple. It's a pretty gigantic number.
And I have two thoughts on this. One, I'm very glad I got the 15 Pro Max last year. Otherwise, I would be missing out. But I've had this conversation with 3 people in the past 2 days, and that may not sound like a big, statistically relevant number, but I don't go around talking about iOS 18 and WWDC to just anybody. But of the 3 people I talked to, nobody had an iPhone 15 Pro or newer, except for myself. But everyone was like, I'm considering upgrading just to take advantage of this Apple AI. Apple Intelligence. Got to get the name right. But I think it's interesting that they've come out with this feature, because typically, every year they come out with a new phone. It's like, oh, there's a new camera, there's a new this, there's a new that. But it seems like this AI is going to potentially be a pivotal moment for the iPhone.
I agree, and especially because the iPhone revenue has actually dropped. It went down from 2022 to 2023. So it's still a monster number. So just for context, iPhone revenue was $200 billion in 2023. That was actually a 3% drop year over year. But going back to that rough math I did, even if 10% of those customers who have an older version of an iPhone upgrade, that's $131 billion in revenue, just if 10% upgrade. And I will be upgrading to a new phone to take advantage of these new features. I will be in that 10%. And I suspect 10% is probably a floor. Like, I think that's a very conservative assumption of the number of people that will upgrade to be able to take full advantage of all of this new functionality. And it just, to me, it speaks to something that's so important in business, which is having a really deep understanding of your customers, so that as you're bringing new solutions to market, you can make sure that it's hitting that sweet spot of what it is that they need, and give you an opportunity to drive incremental revenue, drive upsell from those customers.
And one thing to keep in mind here, Gabe, and this goes back to another one of the conversations I had with a friend, was, okay, cool, now he's got to get a new iPhone, but now he has to get a new MacBook, because he's got this outdated MacBook that can't take advantage. I think you have to have like the Apple Silicon M1 and up chips. Don't quote me on that. But you need the Apple Silicon chip. So now, you need the new iPhone, you need the new MacBook. Maybe you want to throw an iPad in on that mix as well. But it's going to be fascinating. And I told you, I'm one of those people that goes out day one, downloads the beta. This time, I was a little disappointed because the AI isn't on, the developer beta. So I have to wait until the fall to try that again. But I really want to see, what you can actually do with this. How can I actually use this? Because in the Apple presentations, and we'll talk about some of the features they announced here in a minute, but I'm one of those people, I just want to get the hands-on experience. And I think once people get that, if they don't have an updated phone today, after using it, after seeing people use it, that's going to be the next step for them.
Yeah, there'll be like the weird peer pressure of like when somebody sends you a Genmoji, and you can't send one back, that you're going to be super disappointed and you're going to have to go out and upgrade just because of that fact. Like, there's definitely going to be a peer pressure component of upgrading your phone for sure.
Oh man, fear of missing out, man. It's in marketing. It's everywhere.
FOMO's real, dude. Yeah, seriously. You mentioned the actual event, and I just wanted to go back to something you told me, Zach, around the actual event. We had talked about how they filmed the event. Can we talk about that for just a moment? Because I don't want to lose that in the conversation today.
Oh man, we've got a lot to talk about. This is something that's not actually new to WWDC, and it's something that, if I didn't tell you, Gabe, I think we watched clips on YouTube or clips live, but you would have never noticed.
Never known.
WWDC and past Apple events are being filmed on iPhones. And the reason I bring that up isn't to be like, oh, iPhone's got a cool camera. Every flagship smartphone has a good camera, right? You can't convince me otherwise. But when it comes down to creating content, the marketers on the podcast with us today, it's as easy as grabbing your iPhone and going out and shooting that video. Apple said they edited their production on a Mac too. I don't know what they use, but Gabe, we edit this podcast on iMovie. Like, we're using the free tools included. I think it's a fantastic tool, whether it's an iPhone or a Google Pixel. Being able to take that quickly and build quality content is huge today.
Yeah, agreed. And you make a great point, which is it doesn't matter which smartphone you have, all of them have really high quality cameras. If Apple, literally the largest company in the world from a market cap perspective now that their market cap has gone up the last few days after all of these Apple Intelligence announcements, if they can push out content for their biggest event and every single part of it was filmed on an iPhone, I'm pretty confident that marketers can create high quality videos to put out on social and in other aspects of their business. You don't need a $10,000 camera setup to be able to do this. You have the technology sitting in your pocket to be able to do that. So I just thought, I would have had no idea if you did not tell me that. It's wild that, again, the biggest company in the world is doing that for their most important event. And I think it's something that we could all take away as marketers to remember that, we have a lot of resources at our disposal to be able to do this stuff effectively.
The funny thing to me is the production budget for these events they've been doing since COVID, it's got to be high. But yet, knowing now they're filming it on an iPhone, and I've seen the picture, it's like an iPhone in like a gimbal just to stabilize, nothing fancy there. But just knowing it's being filmed on an iPhone, and they've got the plane special effects. They had a Craig Federighi stunt double. That's something I never thought I'd be Googling, but it's just so interesting that such a big event is filmed on an iPhone.
Yeah, it's pretty wild, for sure.
So Gabe, moving into WWDC, Apple Intelligence. What exactly is Apple Intelligence? We know what artificial intelligence is. We talked about ChatGPT, OpenAI, what some other players are doing in the space, Microsoft with Copilot as well. Apple Intelligence is new. What can you tell us about Apple Intelligence?
Well, I think some of the key differences here with Apple Intelligence versus what we've seen with a lot of the other tools that have come into play is that privacy was discussed very aggressively at WWDC. I actually tried to do some research around how many times they said the word privacy in that presentation, because I felt like it came up every 15 seconds and I could not find the word count. But I know it was a lot. They talked about it so much, and they talked about how everything that they're doing from an AI perspective is built with privacy in mind. And that's a big difference from how a lot of the other AI tools that have been developed up to this point are thinking about it. So, we've talked about this before, Zach, that, Apple is very focused on privacy. That classic Apple logo turning into the lock, right? They've just continued to that. And because of that, there's a tremendous amount of trust that's built up with their customer base. So again, everything that they built was really focused on that privacy, private cloud, activity actually happening on the phone or the device, the computer, or whatever. And that's why that's why they're pushing the upgrade, people to upgrade, because they need that processing power in order to do it. But those were really the big thing. That to me was the fundamental, really big thing that was so different about how they talked about AI versus how most companies discuss it.
Exactly. And I think, when you use AI models, whether it's Google, ChatGPT, Copilot, there's an understanding of what data am I feeding this and how is it being used, right? Because once that's sent off, we don't know really what happens. Now with Apple, you mentioned on-device processing as much as they can. They're using some Apple Silicon servers that they've custom built for some external processing through what they call private cloud compute. And I think the privacy here is a bit above my pay grade as to what exactly Apple's doing. They've added some, what they've called like the 5 safeguards into how they're privatizing that data. But one of the cool things here is the ChatGPT integration as well. And there was an interview with Tim Cook, and he made it very clear that Apple Intelligence and the ChatGPT are two very separate things, right? So Apple Intelligence, that's where all of this on-device, and we'll talk about some of the examples here, that's where all of that is happening. Whereas the Chat GPT, that is an optional, Siri might say, hey, do you want me to ask Chat GPT? You can say, yes, ask Chat GPT, or you can cancel. So that's a very much an optional integration. I basically think of it as an API call to Chat GPT,
That's pretty much what it is. And I think what you said there is really interesting, which is when you make that request, it isn't going to do it unless you say yes. And that is the big difference between, again, a lot of the other tools and what Apple has built in. That's just a fundamental difference in how they think about this stuff versus a lot of other technology companies.
So we've been leading up to this, Gabe, but what exactly is Apple Intelligence? We talked about the privacy. We talked about even the Chat GPT integration, although I just said that was separate. Keep that in mind. Number one, and I've been asking for this for like a decade now, since high school, enhance Siri. Siri has been total trash. And seeing some of the examples, again, they showed some great examples. One of the ones they use is, when is mom's flight landing? Well, if you ask Siri that today, you're not going to get a good response. But when you ask with Apple Intelligence, it's going to validate who your mom is in your contacts, number one. Two, it's going to comb through maybe an email, text messages, wherever that information is at on your device, and find that flight information. It's going to process the request and then give you information. So a lot of data coming together there, and that's one of the examples they gave us. So very high level. But I have been asking for a new Siri for the longest time. But another cool thing it does is it's more contextually relevant. So if you want to backtrack when you're talking and be like, oh, what's the weather in, Los Angeles? Oh, sorry, I mean San Francisco today. It's actually going to pick up on that and provide you a new response based on maybe a slip of the tongue or, something just wasn't phrased correctly.
Sure. Yeah, and that contextually relevant piece I think is really important. And as you said, being able to have this kind of back and forth conversation with the AI. And the other example that was used, or one of the other examples that was used, was, tell me what the weather is in Muir Woods, and then, let's schedule a hike for 10 o'clock on Tuesday. And then it actually went into your calendar and blocked that time off. And I thought that was kind of cool, of being able to, and the other cool part is, when the person said, schedule me a hike, they didn't have to say, schedule me a hike at Muir Woods. It just said there. And it knew that because you'd been talking to the AI about going to Muir Woods, then it just scheduled it at that time, right? So I thought that was a really interesting example of that context piece that gets lost a lot in AI.
I'm very excited to try it. Like I said, there's the beta open now, but the AI component isn't coming until later this summer, potentially this fall, even as iOS 18 launches. But I think it's going to be a fantastic tool. And we're talking really about iOS and on your phone. But keep in mind, they're bringing this to iPad and Mac OS as well. So within the Apple ecosystem, this is going to be very much tied into the apps we use every day.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, much like Copilot is for all so much of our work stuff, Zach.
And Gabe, you have to keep me honest here. Can Copilot, if I say like, hey, schedule a meeting on Monday when person 1 is available, person 2 is available, person 3 is available, can Copilot do that? Because I feel like that would be like the prime AI use case, is meeting scheduling based on calendar availability.
I haven't actually tried to schedule a meeting that way before, just using natural language. I should definitely test that. I mean, that to me is one of the most interesting and exciting things about Copilot and using it on a day-to-day basis, is it can comb through all of the interactions that you're having, whether it's through email, Teams messages, these sorts of things, and consolidate that in a really succinct way. I had an example earlier this week where my boss had asked me for something, and we had been talking about it in multiple Teams threads and in multiple emails, and I'm like, oh my gosh, am I going to have to go back and read through all of this content to come up with a list? And I actually just asked Chat to do it, and it came up with a perfect list summarizing all of the things from disparate places. But I have not tried that scheduling one yet. I'm going to totally test that when we.
You bring up another great Apple Intelligence feature, was finding files that I created yesterday, or whatever that case may be. Mm-hmm. That's one of the ones I'm excited for too on Mac.
Yeah, for sure. That'll be a great one for Mac for sure. And then, moving on here, Zach, I think, so much of what we've been talking about around AI is generative AI, right? And creating new content, whether that's written, whether that's image, and that was a huge focus of Apple as part of this WWDC announcement too. Creating content, whether it be through email, if you're on your MacBook, or or even on your phone, creating images, unique images to send to your mom. Mom, you're a super. The example they use is like, Mom, you're a superhero, and created a little image of your mom as a superhero, right? I mean, like, there's just some of that cool stuff that just gets integrated directly into things like iMessage that I actually think people are going to use the crap out of. Like, that will probably be a very popular use case.
Genmoji will be like my number one iOS 18 feature now. I can guarantee it.
Yeah. No, that one is going to get used a lot. And not to step on something that we're going to talk about later, but, that's one where Genmoji is something that other apps existed to do that previously, and Apple just completely murdered their entire business model. Because now why would anybody go out and pay for a separate app if you can just have it directly built into your iPhone?
Yeah, and the Genmoji, that was really cool. So basically what Genmoji is doing, it's creating kind of like your own custom emojis. So like the example they gave in the presentation was, show me a T-Rex on a skateboard, and it created a little emoji. And I'm already thinking of like, oh, what can I do with this? I mentioned Gabe. I was like, I'm going to do one, like get Gabe on Excel in here and see what we can do with that. But it's tools like that, in the image generation case, I don't want to say there's not really a true use case. It's something fun, having those images and those emojis when people use them on their device anyway. But I'm very excited for the things like being able to do summaries or edit text, proofread text, those system-wide tools. I think that's going to be a really nice integration as well.
For sure. Well, and the Genmoji to me is like almost like the gateway drug into AI, right? So it's, hey, this is a fun way to do it, and you're going to start having these conversations with the AI via natural language and having it create this thing. You're like, this is really cool. This is fun. And I suspect it's going to be the way that people start to just get into AI a little bit more by using those fun things on their phone.
And the last one here, just new with Apple AI, I feel like this is going to be my favorite, is just the ChatGPT 4.0 integration. And I don't know if I mentioned that previously, but yes, ChatGPT from OpenAI, but it's using that 4.0 model that we talked about previously. So very excited to use that, and I don't know. I just you start thinking all the different use cases, Gabe, and how you can use this, and we won't know much of how we can actually use this until we get it in our hands. But seeing what Apple has showed us, and again, taking that Siri prompt, you can even kind of type it in like a text message, send it to ChatGPT and get that response, all without leaving or going to the OpenAI app or website. I think it's going to be very cool having that built into the system.
Agreed. Well, and they talked about multimodal, and image, how you can upload an image. I think the example that they used as a use case was take a picture of your deck and suggest what plants might look good in this or work well in this particular area, and the AI is smart enough to know, like, oh, well, you've got a lot of sunlight coming in, and so these are the types of plants that would potentially work well. So it's multimodal, like we've talked about before, where you can again just send that image in and get a response and something that's contextually relevant. And again, it's optional, right? I think that's the other big thing here, Zach, is to go back to that. It's that privacy first. Being able to, if people want to use it, the functionality will be there, but it will not be the default like it is in so many other places.
And I feel like we should call this out too, but there was a comment made at a follow-up WWDC session. Oh, that's an acronym. And they talked about, will Apple bring in other models in the future? And it sounded like it was very much either being considered today or an option in the future, specifically with Google Gemini. So I go back to, what's the default search engine on an iPhone? It's Google, right? But you can customize that. Well, maybe we have that same conversation of what's the default AI model on your iPhone. Today it's OpenAI, ChatGPT, but maybe in the future you could pick between Gemini, ChatGPT, and whatever else is out there.
Yeah, I thought that was a really interesting comment, that they weren't, even with the agreement that they have with OpenAI, that they weren't necessarily tied to that as an exclusive, hey, that's the only model we're going to use. This stuff's all still so new, Zach, and it's going to be really interesting to see how it shakes out. But I think that one of the biggest things that's jumped out to me, just going back and watching the event and thinking about the business model, is again how much this is going to drive hardware sales. And the reality is that's what they care about. It's not, Apple doesn't care about providing this technology to you. They care about selling you more stuff. And this is a great way for them to sell you more stuff by understanding what their customers want.
And Apple's one of those companies where they've built this platform, right? You have the devices, and now they can add those software, those managed services on top of it, right? We've talked about this previously with, I don't know if we ever talked about this on a podcast episode, and I don't know the correct number off the top of my head, but Apple's iPhone business is bigger than, or was it, I can't remember which business model it was now, but one of their businesses is, it's the managed services Apple. The services business, their revenue is more than their watch, wearable, iPad.
Yeah, it's
combined.
Massive. Their services business is massive, and it's crazy high margin, right? So there's not a lot of cost to deliver those types of services. I mean, I think you can definitely see a world in the future where Apple has their, I think it's Apple One they call it, right, where they roll some of the subscriptions together. Apple TV, the storage capabilities to increase the amount of storage that you have in the cloud, those sorts of things. Apple Fitness. By the way, I was thinking about Apple Fitness. We didn't talk about this at all, but I think there's a massive opportunity to monetize that more, because right now it kind of sucks. I don't know if you've ever used it, but it's not great. But that Fitness Plus is part of that Apple One subscription too. But can't you see a world where Apple Intelligence and some sort of like advanced capabilities around AI is part of that Apple One subscription? To me, that just makes a ton of sense.
And that's kind of where I thought they were going initially when they talked about private cloud compute. I thought, okay, is this going to be something? I pay for iCloud storage, so I think I have iCloud Plus today, and they have like private relay. So I thought, okay, maybe I'll have access to this. But it sounded like for the most part they're going to include this. They did make a comment about you'll also have access to your paid ChatGPT features if you log in. But again, just going back to the point here, once you get that compatible iPhone, Apple's going to have those additional services on top of that you can then use. And Gabe, back to the math at the beginning of the episode, you've got to have that iPhone 15 Pro or 15 Pro Max, right? Like you have to upgrade to do all of this. FOMO.
FOMO, baby. Well, and to we're kind of bouncing around this topic, but one of my favorite things in business that we talk about all the time, bundling. Right? And that's what Apple One has done with bundling all of these things together. If I'm OpenAI and I want to drive more subscribers to my paid service, if I bundle that into an Apple One subscription and I just take a portion of that off, basically I've now opened up my addressable market to everybody who has an iPhone on the planet. And even if I get a small percentage of those people paying me and I'm able to carve out a piece of that, that's potentially a lot of revenue and a lot of really high margin revenue back to somebody like OpenAI. So I think there's some really interesting business models that are going to pop up out of this once we start to see this get a little bit further down the line.
I'd love to know what the agreement with OpenAI is. If you recall, Google paid Apple billions, I don't remember the amount, to be the default search. And now we've got this interesting partnership between Apple and OpenAI, where Apple's sending OpenAI data, but OpenAI is the default. Surely it's going to be leaked someday, and I can't wait to see it on the news.
That's going to be fascinating. Well, and so I'd love to talk, I definitely want to talk more to Zach about kind of the business models that were disrupted this week and why it's so important to have a moat when you're in any business. What are some of the ones that really jumped out to you as you were watching WWDC going, well, cool, I don't even need that product anymore. It's now built into my iPhone.
I've got a list. I honestly have a list. Number one, passwords. I use a password manager app. I almost said which one, probably shouldn't, but I use a password manager app. And seeing what Apple's done, all I'm thinking now is as long as I don't have to use Safari, I like Firefox and Chrome, as long as I can continue using whatever browser I want, I'll switch. I will switch day one. I really hope they have like a tool that allows me to switch to I think it's just called Apple Passwords, but
I think
I'll totally
that's what it
use
was
it.
too. But yeah, just to clarify that point, as part of the iOS 18 update, they are building basically a password manager directly into iOS 18. So these separate tools, these separate password manager tools, really not super relevant anymore if you have an iPhone. You can just use the one that's built directly in. So if I were in one of those businesses, I would be not super happy this week because they've effectively just built software that, it takes a huge chunk out of my business.
Gabe, not only that, but I think it's important to think of maybe your new iPhone users or people who don't yet have a password manager. Apple's going to come out with this. People will use it, and it creates stickiness now, right? They maybe don't want to leave the Apple ecosystem because they have all their passwords in the password app, and who knows, maybe you can export them or whatever. But this is just another way that Apple's adding that stickiness into their ecosystem, and I'm optimistic. I want to see what this looks like.
That's such a great point, Zach, and I hadn't even thought about that aspect of it, but you're right. I mean, you're just embedding yourself more deeply into the lives of your customers, and I think that's true of any business. We see this a lot in the business that we both work in, is that if you're able to get services in market that further embed yourself in the day-to-day life of your customer, parental controls, cameras in your home, those sorts of things, those are really sticky services, and people are much less likely to leave when they're rolling out those kind of things.
I've been trying to get my parents on a password manager app for at least, I don't want to say too long, for the longest time now. And I think this is the solution, right? It's a free app. It's going to be built into, again, their iPhones, iPads, Macs. Again, added stickiness there. The next one here, Gabe, and this one I think might be the number one app, but Grammarly. Apple has proofreading built in. I think this is going to be dangerous territory.
For Grammarly, yeah, I think they're going to be in a really tough spot. And frankly, they were probably in a tough spot already with so many of the other tools like Copilot, like we talked about before, tools like Gemini AI, being built into the Google products. But now you've got all of this proofreading capability built directly into the iPhone. It's going to be tough for them to get people to pay for that service when everything's effectively built in.
And not only built in, but I wish I could show the UI UX right now, but it's legit a little pop-up. I don't want to call it a pop-up, but it's like a little pop-up tab that's right alongside the content. You don't have to switch apps. You don't have to install a plugin or anything. It's deeply integrated into the system.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a huge point, and you're right. The Grammarly piece kind of sits. I've seen people. I don't use it on a day-to-day basis. I've certainly used it in the past, but I've seen people who have it kind of integrated in as that pop-up or add-in, and it's clunky. I mean, just to be honest, it's kind of sits over the top of whatever you happen to be working on, and it's a bit clunky for sure. So it's going to be really interesting to see how many people end up moving off of that platform. Some of the other ones that jumped out to me as we were looking at this were, there were specific apps built around call recording, call transcripts, voice transcription. All of that is now going to be built in also. So if you were using one of those apps to do that type of stuff before, it's basically not necessary anymore. It's all going to be in your phone.
I don't know. I'm just thinking it would be so awkward to be one of the developers behind these big apps, going to WWDC, this developer conference, and then Apple coming out with this feature, and it's like, oh, well, that's the final nail in the coffin for my app. But
what's funny, Zach, is that actually the next one that was on the list was this mirror iPhone to Mac, and the guy who created that app, the most popular version of the app that does that currently, put out a tweet that basically said exactly what you just said, which is, oh man, I guess that's it for us. I got to go back to the drawing board and find something else to do. I mean, he fully just admitted it, that now that it's built into the platform, his business model has now just completely upended and gone away.
Yeah, I'm actually very excited for that. One feature we didn't talk about, Gabe, specific to the iPad, is when did the iPad come out? 2010, after 24 years now of not having a calculator app, the iPad has a calculator app. But that's not the cool thing, because I was talking to one of my friends, and we were watching live, and when it came out, the calculator app, my friend was like, well, that's another app I won't use. But I was like, you're going to change your mind in about 10 seconds, because my stream was ahead. But then they have the ability to take your Apple Pencil and draw out equations and draw out whatever you're trying to do. And we actually saw this in an OpenAI demo a few weeks ago, which was very interesting. But then, like in real time, Apple is going to solve whatever math you write out, not only in the calculator app, but in the notes app as well. So if that's added stickiness, maybe. I personally don't take notes, outside of OneNote, so I probably won't be too interested. But I think when I was in college, my econ classes, I had an app where you would write out your math, and it'll kind of solve it with you. There it is, built into the iPad.
The educational use cases, I think, are going to be really interesting for exactly what you just talked about. And it was that example that we saw a few weeks ago from OpenAI, where they were solving or not even solving, it was coaching the person through how to solve the problem, right? Rather than actually solving it for them. So you're already starting to see that kind of integration into the iPad. But the other one that really jumped out to me from an education perspective was if you're taking notes, and it had the ability to generate, like if you've got a rough sketch of something, you can circle that up and actually have generative AI create a better image of that for you for your notes, which I thought was really interesting. So that, again, those note-taking educational use cases, I think there's going to be some really, really interesting ways that people leverage that.
There's two more I want to talk about, but one of them, I have to bring this up, and I'll have to find the video clip for you, Gabe, but I believe it was Craig Federighi probably 10 years ago when I think it was related to AirDrop. And there used to be an app on iPhone called Bump, and you would basically bump your phones together, share information, share data, whether it's contacts or whatever. Android had it too. Google actually bought that company. The app, ceased to exist, and we were doing things wirelessly now. Apple seems to be backtracking. The exact quote from Craig Federighi was like, "No need to wander around your room," like bumping phones together. And he made this big deal out of it. But we've kind of gone back now, because the example of like the Apple Pay, like bumping your phones to watch your cash disappear from one phone to the other. So many memes about that, right? Like nothing worse than losing a bet with a friend and like watching the money like go away from your phone. But I thought that was interesting. Walking back a little bit on that, but
yeah, I thought that was interesting too. It's the visuals of it were quite hilarious, as you said, with that, like literally the money getting sucked out of one phone and showing up in another. But if I'm Cash App, if I'm Venmo, if I'm one of these companies that's built for people sending money back and forth personally, I'm not sure that I'm thrilled about that new feature that's come to iPhone, where you could just hold the iPhones close together and transfer money that way. That's actually a really, like you said, it may be recycling history a little bit, but it's still a clever way to do it, and it's a nice way to keep people in your ecosystem, right? The Apple Pay ecosystem versus something else.
Yeah. Last one here, Gabe. I'm a big AllTrails user. I actually was just talking to a colleague about this, and we were talking about how with iOS 18, Apple has like a kind of a hiking map built in. Looks like they started with national parks, which is fantastic. I really want to use this. I really want to try it out. But the way I explained it was AllTrails has such a community behind it. Whether it's adding photos, reviews, the graphs, the data behind it, the community, as a whole. I don't know if Apple can capitalize on that. So I'm very interested to see where that goes. I will absolutely try it out and get back to you. But I think that's another one I'm very interested in.
I'm curious about that one too, because you're right. There is much more of a community built up around AllTrails, and I actually just used AllTrails last week. I was traveling and I was looking for a running trail, and I was basically searching for best hiking trails or running trails for the area that I was in last week, and I ended up on an AllTrails website where people were talking about this particular trail that I wanted to go check out, and I was basically trying to determine if it was safe for me to go by myself. So it was very nice to have some reviews. But you're right, that community is great. What's ironic is that Apple has this massive community of people who use their devices every day and are oftentimes pretty maniacal about their love of said devices. So if anybody can build a community, you'd think it would be Apple. And this gets back to kind of a comment I made earlier too about Apple Fitness and how it sucks because there isn't really a community built around that. To me, there's a lot of opportunity for them to figure out how to build community more into the fitness parts of Apple, especially because so many of us are wearing these these Apple Watches around all the time.
And look at Peloton for your example. I mean, look at that community. And Apple, for the most part, hasn't been able to capitalize on that. They haven't been able to, kill off the fitness apps yet.
Why they haven't just bought that company, I do not understand, especially with it completely tanking. But
They don't want the hardware.
Yeah, I guess. But they're a hardware company. It seems like such a natural. Anyway, I digress. But again, there seems like there's just so much opportunity there around building a community. And you're right. It will be interesting to see whether people jump off of something like AllTrails and start to use the custom maps that are built more into into the iOS platform. That's one I'm curious about. That's one where I'd probably say the risk is a lot lower than something like a Cash App or a Venmo or a custom emoji. When that stuff's just built directly in, that's going to have a materially negative impact on some of these other businesses.
I'll tell you right now, I'm still going to use Venmo.
But you love Apple Pay. You talk about how awesome it is all the time.
I do, but keep in mind, the Venmo app has a community. I can go on and see what people are sending money to each other for. I can try to come up with my creative send money responses. But it's funny because, the Apple Pay, Apple Cash, I don't know how long it's been a product. It's been a product for the longest time. But I've only ever had, 2 people send me money via Apple Pay. It's always been Venmo and Cash App. I actually started on Cash App and then moved to Venmo. So, I will use the best solution right now. I think that's Venmo, but you never know. Apple could be onto something there as well.
I think they could be, and I think it's again, even if they take a small percentage of that business, it's potentially really negatively impactful for some of these other businesses like PayPal that owns Venmo. PayPal doesn't monetize Venmo in any way right now at all, which is a massive opportunity for them. But if, again, I were PayPal, I probably wouldn't be super happy about the announcements that just came out this week.
If Venmo monetizes their solution, I will immediately go to Apple Pay Cash. So keep that in mind. But Gabe, I think we have a conversation we need to follow up here on in September when this is more widespread. If the beta comes out sooner with the OpenAI component and the Apple Intelligence built in, I'll be the first person to download that and then have to reset my phone because it's terrible. But no, I'm very excited. Like I said, there's a lot of new features, whether it's with Apple Intelligence or some of the new apps and functionality they've brought out. But I think it's going to be interesting to see how Apple continues to build on this platform with new software enhancements.
Yeah, no doubt. And I think that's a great way to end it, Zach, which is, this is the brilliance of Apple, is that they have this really fantastic hardware solution and they continue to figure out new ways to get people to buy more hardware and build these software components on top of it to keep people sticky in the solution. And it's, I think, something that for any of us working in business, we can take some really interesting takeaways from how they run their business and how successful they are. Obviously, we're never going to be Apple, but there's some really great things that we can learn from them and how they run their business.
Absolutely. Well, don't forget to give us a follow on your favorite podcast app and stay tuned for next week's episode as well.